and this year's list of ups and downs. Joining me are Greater Boston's John Carroll, television producer Callie Crosley, Dan Kennedy of the Boston Phoenix, and Bob Zelnick of Boston University. First, September 11th, the media capital of the world suddenly became the story of the world. John has this look back.
At first, there was simple disbelief.
Oh, my goodness.
Oh, God.
There's another one. Oh, my goodness, there's another one.
The news media spent September 11th very much like everyone else, watching the world crumble around them.
Good Lord. There are no words.
In the days that followed, news people were still like the rest of the country. They surrendered to displays of emotion.
See those firemen?
And waved the flag with equal fervor. Caught up in the moment, television network executives even acquiesced to National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice when she asked that they effectively bar Osama bin Laden from their airwaves. But soon enough, the news media started acting more like themselves.
Please don't do that. Please, everybody's been so good for 2 weeks, are we all going to change now?
When the war began in Afghanistan and news organizations were left out of the battle plan, it became very much media business as usual.
A military operation is one of the most important functions that the government undertakes on our behalf, and the public really is entitled to good, solid information about how those operations are being conducted.
Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld worked hard in his daily briefings to convince the press he was on their side.
In our democracy, the work of the Pentagon Press Corps is important. Defending our freedom and way of life is what this conflict is about, and that certainly includes freedom of the press.
Just not too much freedom. Stymied by the military, the press turned on itself as rival networks began questioning CNN's access and sympathies overseas.
Now that, of course, comes just a day after Taliban had taken us to a remote hillside village.
The whispering campaign got loud enough that CNN News President Walter Isaacson ordered up on-air disclaimers.
We just remind you, as we always do now with these reports from inside the Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, that you're seeing only one side of the story.
Meanwhile, another story hit the news media even closer to home.
A member of my personal staff who has contracted a cutaneous anthrax infection.
After anthrax also surfaced at ABC and made headlines in other news outlets, the predictable gallows humor surfaced in the media as well.
My first thought was that Peter Jennings and Dan Rather had to be probably fairly irritated that somebody didn't send them some.
Small world, Rather's office was targeted right after that.
While the threat of terror, whether through the air or the mail, is with us, always now, fear need not be.
Funny thing, though, the anthrax attacks made the news media once again act very much like everyone else.
This is so unfair and so outrageous and so maddening, it's beyond my ability to express it in socially acceptable terms.
Then again, with 8 journalists dead in Afghanistan, socially acceptable terms have been pretty much redefined.
Boy, every time I look back, it's just remarkable what journalists were able to collect in war coverage, despite, you know, the Pentagon limitations on their ability to go in. And you think since that first restrictions were placed on them, the material that they've been able to gather, even in the last couple of weeks, has just been astounding.
There's been some really terrific stuff. I mean, you look from the magazine, somebody like Elizabeth Rubin in the New Republic, to radio, which has done a terrific job, to the networks and the cable nets. I mean, people have really been enterprising in this because they've had to be, and it's led to some situations of journalists being ambushed and journalists being basically robbed and killed. That's the price for this kind of a war. We talked about that before. It's a different kind of war with no front, and it's a little more freelance than it was.
I wonder if the Pentagon has any regrets. Do you think, Bob, about not allowing journalists in?
I haven't seen any threats evident. I think they regard it as a fair trade-off for being able to control the story, even deciding which portions of a bin Laden tape they're going to release. But I think journalists are showing once again what makes them good journalists, and that is there are obstacles in lots of assignments. There are obstacles when I was over covering the Soviet Union, they did their best to deny access. When the Pentagon fought the Gulf War, they did the best to deny access. And reporters are inventive. They go out with the Northern Alliance troops. They go in and accept invitations from Taliban. They get the story. That's their job.
And the Pentagon, whether hypocritical or not, did apologize for keeping the press back after the incident of friendly fire. Yeah. Well, so that was you know, I can't say whether it was genuine or not, but that did happen.
That was a classic example. They did the same thing during the Gulf War and got away with it with impunity. So why should they change?
Yeah.
There were more, except for that lucky Scud shot by the Iraqis in the closing days of the war. There were more U.S. casualties to friendly fire than there were to enemy fire in Iraq, and the press saw none of it.
It's much easier for the Pentagon to apologize after the fact than it is to allow access up front. More broadly, I mean, I do think that post-September 11th has been, with a few exceptions, a very proud moment for the media, not just in covering the war, but in covering the whole domestic front. I'm very impressed with how much attention has been given to the sort of assault on civil liberties that we've seen. I guess the question as we go into the new year is there going to be any slippage back into focus on celebrity and scandal, or has this shaken us all up so much that we have moved into sort of a new paradigm where we are going to have more serious coverage of public issues?
I'm pessimistic about that because the people who did the good work here are the journalists.
That's right.
But they're creatures of the system, and the forces that were driving journalism, and particularly network television journalism, to irrelevance are there. It's the conglomerates. It's the polls that show what the surveys, the focus groups that show
the appetite.
Yes, exactly, and that's going to come back with a vengeance.
As Callie predicted months ago.
Right, and I was going to say, the Tom Green and Drew Barrymore breakup got a lot of press. Dan, where were you? So, I mean, I think we're seeing it come back very much.
That's a good point.
But there's always a place for that. I mean, the question is that going to move back to the top of what we do? I mean, that's what I worry about.
And there's a question also of how they're handling the September 11th aftermath. We just saw this reunion that was staged for the cameras, basically between a rescuer and one of the people in the World Trade Center who we rescued. And something should happen out of sight of the camera, I think. Not everything has to happen on camera at this point.
All right, well, almost everything we focused on prior to September 11th became irrelevant. The stories that once captured the headlines and fed the cable news maw just didn't matter anymore. First item to the back burner, the scandalous story of a love affair between California Congressman Gary Condit and missing congressional intern Chandra Levy. A story that consumed the airwaves for 4 months and 10 days.
Police are still looking for clues to the disappearance of Chandra Levy.
And the clueless were tripping all over themselves for any nugget, no matter how bogus.
Washington police are investigating an anonymous tip that the body of Chandra Levy is buried.
After 9/11, the Chandra Levy-Gary Condit story was buried, but remains a legitimate mystery. Also off the front pages, the feeding frenzy over sharks. A couple of unfortunate encounters, and you'd think the sharks were about to become the birds.
They started thrashing and bumping the boat.
With fishtails like that to keep the presses rolling, the media was the last to want to hear the truth.
Safe out there. No problem out there.
Also, now no problem, Governor Paul Cellucci's sudden departure to Canada midway through his second term.
What makes you qualified to be ambassador to Canada? What's wrong with being governor of Massachusetts? It's not like you're going off to war.
No, but war and terrorism drove Cellucci out of the public mind faster than a skier down Mount Tremblant. Also relegated to the irrelevant, the Jane Swift popularity contest.
87% said they do not have confidence in Jane Swift's ability to govern Massachusetts.
And the impending birth of twins made it worse, especially when business was conducted by phone from her hospital bed.
I want to thank the members of the Governor's Council for accommodating me today.
Also off the course of concern, Swift's marital questions.
Did you know before you married your husband that he had been married 3 times previous?
But in the wake of 9/11, Swift's decisiveness, no matter how stiffly delivered, earned her high marks. Gone, too, from the collective memory bank, newly elected Congressman Stephen Lynch's tax and loan foibles. He was elected October 16th, in one of the least covered elections in recent history. Also off the radar screen, former Senator Bob Kerry's selective memory about a massacre in Vietnam.
We were fired upon and we returned fire.
And how long ago it seems we cared that Jesse Jackson had an out-of-wedlock love child.
There's news of another sex scandal involving Jesse Jackson.
It's also hard to remember when Rudy Giuliani was just a lame duck.
If you would just back off.
His public squabbling with estranged wife Donna Hanover, public outings with girlfriend Judith Nathan, and too much information about his prostate cancer.
Whether he's capable of performing or not doesn't matter to me.
All that, of course, is ancient history.
Work together to rebuild the city of New York and the World Trade Center to be even greater and more wonderful and more beautiful than it was before.
In fact, New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani has been named Time Magazine's Person of the Year. That, of course, is the biggest turnaround story of the year. How irrelevant, an outgoing mayor was about to become when all of this happened. I still think, though, that some of the things that we covered, you look at all that celebrity stuff, Jesse Jackson and Bob Kerry and all that, but the one that still stands out in my mind as kind of a nagging issue is Gary Condit. And I know we focus way too much attention on all that, but it's a legitimate mystery and it may never be solved.
He's coming in under the radar. He's going to run for re-election and putting the Democrats in an interesting situation. I saw, I can't remember if it was Gephardt or Daschle being grilled over the weekend a couple of weeks ago, saying, "Are you supporting this guy or not?" And he said, "Well, we never get involved in primaries." And so he's basically just putting off until the general election. But that puts them in a very difficult situation. And I think it's all going to come back up again at some point.
Yeah, it's a good example of one that's going to.
Do you blame them? Though I have to say that I, from the beginning, I thought this was a media-driven story. I mean, I do think that it is interesting when a congressman's name comes up in an otherwise untoward
murder
situation. But I mean, no, but I really resent and think it's horrible that journalists pretty much said he was the murderer in a lot of stories. I mean, where did that come from? There is no evidence of that. So that bothers me a great deal.
Well, Emily, everybody has compared this story to Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
And I thought I'd be smart and go back to 1941 and see if there were a lot of stories that were pushed off the front page then. And it was a dumb thing to do because World War II had actually been going on for 2 years. And in the run-up to Pearl Harbor, it dominated every issue of most of the news magazines. No television in those days. And in fact, the week before the Japanese attack, Time magazine said in its copy, the U.S. and Japan are closer to war than ever before.
Wow.
So that's one way in which Pearl Harbor differed from September 11th.
Nothing became irrelevant.
Right.
Well, it wasn't a surprise. This was a surprise.
The Bob Kerry story was a very relevant and important story. And when you look back across that divide from 9/11, and in a way it seems more relevant than it ever did, because here you had a war where young men such as Kerry and the men he commanded were really put in an impossible situation, and were kind of put in a position where they did things that they're really not very proud of after the fact. And now we're involved in this war against terrorism, and I'm not sure what lessons that can be drawn from it, except that it kind of serves as a reminder that you don't want to put American troops in a position that's really impossible for them morally and ethically.
Well, following that, it's also that people are saying in times of war, you can take liberties. I mean, that's the issue now. And so that was also part of the issue with Bob Kerry, whether or not in times of war it allowed him a greater berth to do some things that we may not have approved of otherwise.
But on a personal level, that story is pretty much behind Bob Kerry, unless he decides to run for office again. But if he never runs for office, I don't think that comes back to him. I think that's over for him.
No, but that story was over long before 9/11. It was a fascinating moment, but the story only lasted a couple of weeks anyway.
But doesn't it feel like it was 100 years ago?
Yes, it does.
It doesn't feel like it was this year.
Long time ago. And it wasn't. I think it was the summer or something.
Yeah, I mean, it just
incredible. All right. Well, as for our local listings, there were indeed some changes, and the Globe was at the heart of many of those, right up until the last minute. Last summer, we called the Boston Globe the incredible shrinking newspaper. That's because in addition to consolidating its focus and book sections, 185 Globe staffers took a buyout. And soon after, Globe editor Matt Storen announced his retirement.
This is a day of mixed emotions. Obviously, I'm sorry to be leaving such a great team.
That team now includes the Boston Red Sox, purchased by an investment group that includes Globe parent, the New York Times. The sale to an out-of-town group created not only conflict, but conflict of interest questions as well. Conflict was also the keyword in the Globe's dust-up with WEEI Radio's Dennis and Callahan. Last spring, the paper banned all its sports writers from appearing on the radio talk show for being, no surprise here, offensive.
So, you know, I plead guilty to offensive.
The dust-up got even dustier when Globe columnist Eileen McNamara wrote a column in support of Dennis and Callahan, a column that never got published.
I wrote it, I submitted it, and they killed it.
Also on the not-so-memorable moments list for the Globe, this front-page story on the Zantop murders, reporting an affair between the murdered half Zantop and an unidentified woman. The story turned out to be wrong and led to this front-page correction 5 days later.
I think the story was wrong, and we did apologize to the Zantop family.
The Boston Globe did break some big stories this year, though, including Walter Robinson's bombshell report that Pulitzer Prize-winning historian and Mount Holyoke College professor Joseph Ellis never served in Vietnam, as he's always claimed.
It's tragic. It's an important issue for the college to grapple with, and it's news.
The news cost Ellis a year's pay and his reputation. The Christopher Lydon child sex abuse case raised some thorny issues for the press. An agreement was worked out where cameras would be allowed in court if children were protected.
I think we have a perfect compromise here.
The perfect compromise until NECN blew it, airing a child's name and case number.
My name is and I am victim number.
NECN apologized for the mistake. A story that really wasn't news this year was election 2001. There was the 9th congressional race, where Max Kennedy dropped out before he was even in, after this awkward speech back in May. Channel 7's Andy Hiller summed the situation up nicely.
You're going to hear many explanations of why Max Kennedy's candidacy died today. I'll just remember it as a mercy killing.
Finally, there were some media debuts and disasters this year. The Boston Metro debuted, while the Boston Globe's Bulldog edition and the new magazine Boston Business Forward folded. As for TV, Channel 7's Urban Update was cut back, while WCVB canceled its 25-year-old Sunday public affairs talk show, 5 on 5.
We are out of time.
Let's hope no one says that about us anytime soon.
We're going to be here for a long time coming. So the Globe, all the stories, all the changes there, how big a deal do you think is this potential conflict of interest with the Red Sox?
Well, I mean, it depends on what position you're sitting in. I mean, the editor, Marty Barron, has made it very clear, and I have no reason to doubt his word, that the Globe is going to cover this whole deal very aggressively, and they're not going to worry about the fact that the Times Company is a minority investor in the team, the group that seemed to have gotten the Red Sox. But that said, you know, there's the way that this is treated in the community. I mean, I've interviewed some people in the community, such as Jim St. George of Team, City Councilor Peggy Davis Mullen, and a political figure who did not want to go on the record, saying that they do not want to, people are going to be very reluctant to oppose any sort of public financing deal for a new stadium, to speak out in terms of neighborhood opposition, when they know that the Globe now has an ownership stake.
Yeah, what about their own editorial pages on that?
Well, you know, again, I mean, I don't think that the editorial pages will be under any constraint from going one way or the other. But how will that be perceived in the community? I mean, it's a perception problem.
There's another wrinkle too, which is the whole New England Sports Network, which is part of why the New York Times wanted to be in on this. And if the Globe starts producing programming for NESN, then you've got a much more complicated situation, because they're basically programming for a station owned by the Red Sox, partly owned by the New York Times, and I don't think you're going to be seeing a lot of rip the lid off kind of half hours.
Not that you do on Nesson anyway.
No, but you know, if you're going to go out and program,
of course, you know how I feel about sports reporting.
Right,
yeah.
but a sports.
Well,
you look at HBO Sports; they can do that kind of thing.
Right.
I don't think Nesson's going to be doing that.
And that's not an
think,
if. That's what they're going to do.
The curse of the old gray lady doesn't seem quite as interesting as the curse of the Bambino, for one thing. I did notice already that one or two Globe columnists are savaging the arrangement. So at least in its threshold period, they're maintaining their integrity about this. I personally still think the Yanks are going to dominate the American
What
media.
about some of the other stories, the Xantops? Do you think they acquitted themselves on that story or not?
Horribly.
Yeah, that was bad. But they did, you know.
I mean, did they
at
get
least it was on the front page.
Yeah.
So often these corrections are made, as we know, in the back of the paper. So.
It reminded me of a letter to the editor of the Washington Post someone sent after a horrific story expressing condolences on the death of all their editors. And I had the feeling that it was not only reporters who made an understandable mistake in the heat of competition, but the editors handling the story that didn't take elementary steps that could have prevented this kind of embarrassment. But again, it was a one-shot thing, and presumably a lot of people learned their lessons.
Well, I think it's the risk you run when you're trying to play a high-stakes game in the newspaper business, which is to be out front with stories, to do the kind of, it turns out well sometimes, as in the Ellis situation.
There are high-stakes stories in every situation,
but
and you got to have you got to make your practices sound.
Hey, speaking of high stakes, you know, the Herald ended up outing their source this week. We accused them several weeks ago of not being willing to out one of their inside sources. This guy, Michael Taylor, owns a security company, and by the way, just for the record, they did do that this week. Which
came out in a story about George Cashman.
Kind of buried it, but they did it. Good for them. All right, and finally tonight, our list of this year's ups and downs. John has the roster.
Mobility, both upward and downward, marked the media year. At the Boston Globe, Matt Storin stepped down after 8 years as editor, and Miami Herald transplant Marty Barron said he was up for the challenge of replacing Storin.
And it is my hope that we can build on the accomplishments of the past to create a better Globe.
For starters, Barron might want to consider bringing back Ask the Globe. Who's on first was the appropriate question at WCVB this year. After anchor apparent Heather Kahn moved down to Philadelphia, the domino effect took hold, with Natalie Jacobson upgraded to a solo spot at 6, and Liz Bruner moving up the food chain to anchor the 11.
Acting Governor Jane Swift has named a longtime FBI agent to the base.
Meanwhile, some anchors experience sideways mobility. After 28 years at WCVB, Chet Curtis moved over to NECN.
I'm Chet Curtis, and all day long, the #1 story has been the threat of a major snowstorm.
Stormy weather hit WHDH when anchor Kim Carrigan was fired right before a sweeps period.
There's never been any reason put out there for me.
Carrigan's agent helpfully served up a reason to the Boston Herald's Marjorie Egan, saying that WHDH owner Ed Anson was amoral, immoral, and disgusting. Not surprisingly, Anson was downright ticked off.
I have to stand up and say this is wrong, and my remedy is to pursue a lawsuit.
Anson backed down on that threat while Carrigan popped up on UPN 38's 7 o'clock newscast. Going completely off-screen this year were veteran reporter Gary Armstrong, abruptly fired by WHDH, and longtime WBZ meteorologist Bruce Schwegler, who was retired by the station for the umpteenth time.
I do want to thank you all for watching and welcoming me into your home.
Not welcome in one another's home are Howie Carr and Peter Blute, bookend talk show hosts for WRKO Radio. They've gotten down and dirty about who shot the former Massport chief on his infamous booze cruise.
Come on, Howie, you know exactly what happened there, and you know who did it, but you're not looking into it. Why?
I don't know who did it.
Come on.
I know
But everyone knows who did it to Chris Lydon.
I'm Christopher Lydon. This is The Connection.
The former WBUR host fought a very public battle for part ownership of the popular show, along the way portraying BUR as sort of Stalag 90.9. Since being downloaded by the station, Lydon has produced several webcasts and wound up the year with a 2-week gig on Jamaican radio.
The American public and politicians have practically given up on the idea of rehabilitation.
It's all very Robert Browning. You know, man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's unemployment for? Something like that, anyway.
That's great. You know, we get more email about Christopher Lydon than we do anything else. It's amazing. They think that somehow we're the extension of him, I guess because he used to work here, but we love doing Chris stories.
Yeah, Chris, you just hope that something happens and that Chris doesn't turn into the Blanche Dubois of radio, you know, relying on the kindness of strangers, because I don't know how much further down you can go past Jamaica and still get up here on the webcast.
He really should be back on the air. There's no question about it.
Really very much missed.
Chastened and with using better judgment, but he certainly should. He's a real talent and had an outstanding program. As far as the Howie Peter thing, I guess some people feel that it's just a shame that one of these two guys has to win. I think
they're both losing.
I don't feel that at all.
I think it's a legitimate mystery. Who spent thousands of dollars to get, you know, a public executive thrown out of office? It's amazing that hasn't come forward. And that's, by the way, what I was referring to just a minute ago about the source. This guy, Michael
maybe
Taylor,
that would be more interesting, but I don't care to hear these two guys talk about it. I just do not care.
Well, Peter Blute's point is that any other story, Howie Carr would be all over it. He was certainly all over Peter Blute when it first happened. So it does put Howie Carr in a position of having to explain his absence on this story, and it's unusual. I mean, this is the kind of thing that's meat and potatoes to him.
Hypocrisy are us. That's the journalist creed around here.
Let's not end the year on that kind of a note, huh?
I would say that the mix-up between Blute and Howie on this show was some of the most entertaining 20 minutes of TV I saw all year. It was just terrific.
You know, it's amazing with all the anchor changes. You know, I was thinking 20 years ago, that would have just rocked this town.
That's right.
It would have turned the ratings upside down. Now, I hate to say it, but it's almost like some of the other cities and towns across the country where it's sort of this revolving door of anchors, and it doesn't matter that much anymore.
Well, but I also will say that some of the changes, the people have found different venues, and they were good where they were, and they're good where they went to. So it doesn't necessarily mean that there's just a lack of caring about it, as we might have in the past. But I think that they were good journalists.
Well, there's an anchor machine that generates these people, so it's not surprising that the personalities are regarded as
But that didn't used to be the case
no,
here.
absolutely not. Absolutely
there was no anchor machine. All right, everybody. That was a lot of fun. Thank you for being here, and we'll see you all next year. And that's it for our Beat the Press Year in Review. Monday on Greater Boston, 3 families forever changed by September 11th. Michael McGinty, Paige Farley Hackle, and Judy LaRocque are gone, but not forgotten. That's Monday at 7. For all of us, I'm Emily Rooney. Good night.
Greater Boston is closed captioned for our deaf and hard of hearing viewers. We are grateful to Dunkin' Donuts and Fleet, a Fleet Boston financial company, for making this important service possible.
Wishing you the happiest of holidays from all of us at WGBH. Sending you the best! Woo!
It was a